Hello and welcome to So Many Games, independent video game coverage from a passionate group of people. My name is Jason, and for episode 12 of the podcast, we feature an interview with Jakefriend, the solo developer behind the recently released top-down adventure Metroidvania game Scrabdackle. Scrabdackle has only recently released and is being published by Fellow Traveller. The game takes some inspiration from old Zelda games, but Jake has implemented a ton of interesting and modern features that make it feel really fresh. We delve into these mechanics, the development of the game, and much more in our conversation. One thing I would like to point out here is that the game has been labelled as early access on Steam, thanks to its episodic release, but this first act is fully complete. You'll have the experience meant by Jake if you were to purchase it now. But before we head into that conversation, I would just like to mention our Patreon. If you would like to support independent video game coverage, this would be the best way to do it. We have 3 tiers for you to consider, starting from just £1. If you join our top tier, I'll even send you a random Steam code your way every single month. A massive thank you goes to our current patrons, John, Ruz, Cami, Kurz and Antonia. You guys rule, and we are incredibly lucky to have your support. Check out patreon.com/so-many-games to see everything we have to offer. A link can be found in the show description. If supporting us monetarily isn't right for you right now, and you'd still like to help, then a glorious 5-star rating and review would be amazing. And please tell anyone you think would be interested in our work. We would really appreciate it. Okay, with all that said, let's jump into my conversation with Jakefriend on Scrabdackle.
So I'm Jake, or as a developer, I go by Jakefriend. I used to be a consultant, and around the time that COVID started, I was looking for a job, and I knew it would take a long time just from the very beginning of COVID. I had worked with friends before on their games, on jams and things. Usually I was the artist or musician, and I didn't really do any coding, but I thought I just heard about Godot, which is the open source game engine that I use. And I thought it was a good time where the job market was pretty crowded. I would learn to use an engine that I wasn't familiar with and try out coding for myself. And it all really kind of stumbled uphill into what it's become. I'm still working on the same project that was my learning tutorial project for myself.
Yeah, sure. It's been quite... Was it 5.5 years you've been developing just Act 1 of the game?
Yeah, I've been on this project since, I think, May 2020 is when I first started working on it. Not that I had conceptualized what it was going to become at all. I finished up Act 1 about 1.5 years ago, so I guess early summer 2024, and started working on Act 2 a little bit at that point. And then we decided to release the game episodically. We still had the act structure within the game before, but we weren't planning to release that way. So I went back to do launch prep and sort of release level polish.
For anybody listening that doesn't know or has never heard of Scrabdackle, what is Scrabdackle and what can they expect from playing the game?
This is a tricky question to answer because I think it's a lot of things. So the general idea is that you are a little novice wizard character. You are going exploring in this sort of top-down environment. There's lots of things to do. You've got a spell that helps you sort of study things, down to plants, enemies, a pretty wide variety of things anywhere that you go. So you can learn more about the environment or what your character thinks about it. And there's lots of little hidden challenges here and there or things to do or find. And you sort of just end up starting looking around and you get drawn into a larger story with big sort of almost Zelda-style dungeons connected to a more nonlinear open world space. So I usually average it out to it's something in between sort of a Metroidvania type of game, a Zelda-like type of game, and the boss fights are a little more in the Souls-like category with the approach to them.
Yeah, I was not expecting that, Jake.
Well, it did start out as a game that was about battling bosses initially, with no overworld or anything like that. You would be a wizard, just sort of going into people's dreams and fighting their nightmares, and that was the original scope. But I had a lot of fun with the art design, and I thought maybe, well, for a given boss, I could add a few screens of kind of walking to get there to sort of contextualize it, and it just grew into something. The more I was interested in the world, the more the focus shifted to the world. But there's still a big part of the game that is based on, I really love a tough but fair boss fight with a lot of spectacle.
Yeah, definitely tough, Jake. I was very grateful for the difficulty sliders in the game. But like, I'm really intrigued on like how the idea of Scrabdackle came to be. Like, when you sat down and think, I'm going to make a video game, like, how did you end up with this idea?
I think part of what's tricky about this question is that, like, what the game even is an unexpected outcome for me, where it just grew into elements that I was interested in or liked. I'm a big fan of like the Link's Awakening original Game Boy release, and something about the transitions between screens where it's not a big continuous map, but sort of locked on a single room, the camera, and then you move from one to another. I've just always liked that. And I've always liked the idea of the map as a thing that you can go online and see a map of the entire world because it's all laid out like that. And it just seemed like, oh, maybe I'll start doing this. Okay, I like that. Well, what else do I want to focus on? What else do I want to add? It's really just ended up being the thing that it is, almost by circumstance and a series of small local choices rather than any, I don't know, major specific direction up until I was well into development.
I love a game with exploration, and that's at the heart of Scrabdackle, is exploring the world put in front of you. And what I really was taken aback by was how intricate some of that exploration was. Like, sometimes I would be trying to figure out where I need to go to get access to a certain part, and it ended up being like these really like thin ramps up to a higher terrain that could be 2 or 3 screens away from where I'm trying to end up. And then having to like explore all these like higher areas, and then having to go back down again. Maybe there's like these little ramps that are very well hidden. Well, not really hidden. I don't know. They're in plain sight, but they don't stick out as much. Was this kind of intricate exploration, always the plan when you were coming to make the game?
I think not specifically intricate. I was very interested in making the game and its world extremely nonlinear, actually much more so than how the game ended up turning out. I used to do a lot of sketching out maps for different areas, like the tutorial area, the junk heap, where I would draw little arrows and try and figure out, are there enough different ways a player can go? Are they always going to be stumbling across something? And making sure that there's not sort of one correct way and one incorrect way or something like that. And I feel like the whole trick of the game is trying to get people to care about the world and pay attention via an invisible invitation to, rather than telling them that they should. And part of that comes with the level design of, if you want to think about how do I get this sticker on this hill, well, it's not necessarily hard to get, but you are going to kind of need to circle the hill and think about where the base is that you could get up, even if that's somewhat far away, and sort of manage your path there. And I find that little thing, that kind of thing, it's not exactly a puzzle, but it does make you engage sort of with the area as a real tangible space that you're thinking about more than just what you can see. Mm-hmm. I find that very appealing.
Yeah, I think that's what I really liked about it. It did become a little bit of a puzzle in on itself. You kind of nailed it when you said that. Because there was instances where I just stopped and I was really studying the environment and just trying to figure out the path that I needed to find. And I really enjoyed that as part of the game. I thought it was really well designed.
Oh, thank you. What I'm always trying to aim for, and this is through dialogue, lore, puzzle design, challenge design, anything like that, is like, I would like to give people something kind of worth caring about or paying attention to and reward them for doing so. I think everyone really wants to have a world that is like quote unquote worth discovering. And I feel like a lot of what makes that work or makes that successful, which I don't know that Scrabdackle always is, but I feel like often can be, is when each time that you stop to engage with the world or the setting or something about it, it is rewarding for you, whether that's, you know, a sticker or thinking about how to deal with a quest or a conversation or something like that, macro level and micro level.
One of the other things that really stuck out to me when I played Scrabdackle was its locations. You kind of got maybe the kind of expected locations in a way. You know, you've got your forestry area, you've got your mountain area, you've got your dark, gloomy woods kind of area, but you've really managed to put your own take on those locations. You've managed to make them feel fresh, if you like, instead of me just going, oh, another mountainous area, you know, I've been here before. Do you know what I mean? I really appreciated the work that you put into these locations, especially the Ducklands. I was quite taken to the Ducklands. Did you always have this plan for them, or did you have a more generic path at the beginning of development?
It started out relatively similar. I would sort of just throw out ideas onto, I had a little Excel document where I set up all of the cells into perfect squares, and I would just color them in and look for connections and things like that. Very early on, it's just slapping down names that might fit a place or an idea that might be neat. So some of those end up getting fleshed out over time. Like I start with a very simple sort of bog area because it sort of felt right to have the player start somewhere less interesting and progress to somewhere more interesting. And then the parts of it that become interesting sort of layer in over time. But I do sometimes cut ideas that they're not really going anywhere. And I think you can always feel at the back of your head, like if an idea is really working or not for yourself. For example, so in the game right now in Act 1, there's this big factory called the Manufactory.
Yeah, it's a good area.
Thank you. I always liked this area. I always liked the idea of a big factory. It felt like there were a lot of things that I could do there with, you know, conveyors and automations and things like that. But it didn't have any sort of purpose. And I was wondering about, where do you go after this place? Maybe after the boss, you progress behind it and it goes to the, you know, inside of a volcano, and you can see all of the lava and the rest of the manufactory. It all comes from here. The idea never really sat. It didn't really feel that interesting. It just felt like, sure, well, I've introduced a hazard of lava, so I guess it comes from a volcano. I'll do a generic volcano interior type of area. So later in development, I'm looking at other parts of the world, including stuff in later acts. And I also have this desert area where I'm thinking, you know, there's a lot of things I can do with a desert, but it feels like I've just picked from the, you know, generic video game locations hat. It's not becoming something more unique that I'm more invested in, but can I kind of maybe merge these concepts? And I've ended up with a area that I'm quite happy with now. It is early in Act 2, called Ash Glade, where the sort of conceit is, in the center of the area, there is this big volcano-esque steam crater with boiling water in it, and it releases a lot of ash, and the ash sort of coats the surrounding area in this blackish dust. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of plant life there as well. So I sort of get to have my cake and eat it too. I get this, the mechanics of a volcano area and the mechanics of a desert area, they're sort of combined, and they have a very different aesthetic that has ended up becoming, you know, important to the world and the lore and why this region is where it is and things like that.
One thing I've always been intrigued about, and I've never really had the chance to ask, and I appreciate it's probably quite a difficult task when you're designing a game like this, and that is all the interconnectivity between the locations and the different, you know, items and spells that you need to pick up to be able to access these locations. How difficult is it to plan this kind of, you know, map and making sure everything works how it should? You know, was it, and I'm assuming it was quite a difficult task to do as well.
I mean, it was quite tricky and definitely took a lot of focus. Every now and then you'll get parts that sort of your first attempt at it is it just hits right and you don't really need to tweak it. But a lot of the time, what I frequently found with this project as a whole, including the map design, is if I tried to, fill things out room by room, that never really worked as an approach. And it would always serve me better to leave blank spaces along the way next to whatever part that I'm working at. I will usually have come up with something more interesting to do by the time I come back and figure out how to fill in these blank spaces. Or I have an idea later on that turns out to need more space, and I have these spaces to work with that I've left myself. Like early areas like the junk heap, the rubble ruins, the ducklands didn't really change at any point. Or the academy dungeon, I always had sort of the general conceit for how you move through that area with the hedge maze outside and then the more structured, smaller interior. And I did expand the hedge maze a little bit, but in contrast, something like Blustergust Peak, the sort of mountaintop region, I think went through the most variations in playtesting because it was kind of fun, but the pacing was really off. It was much smaller and shorter and more linear. So I did two separate kind of additional passes where I added rooms and I added just small things to do off to the side so it didn't feel like you were just following the single path forward. And eventually I added little like Surlag rock creatures that got used in sort of puzzle design because there just needed to be something to do that wasn't push forward fight enemies that would update the pacing a little bit. So usually the process is like I kind of just throw things out there, and if it works that's great, and if it doesn't I need to be comfortable revisiting it until it does.
How much do you have to fight yourself to make sure you don't hide stuff too well when you're developing the game? It must be quite hard. Because, I could really be evil here and do this.
I never want someone to go online and ask someone for help to find something hidden. And then when they find it, they think, oh, well, that wasn't fair. I could never have figured that out myself. Sometimes it's tricky and people have different skills. Sometimes a puzzle requires more sort of spatial reasoning and then that's tricky. Or there's a pressure element, like a simple puzzle has an enemy nearby that you can't deal with. And it can be, hard to think in that circumstance. But even if there's a lot of like hidden passages in Scrabdackle where you walk up to a wall that looks just slightly suspicious, and often you can walk beyond it to somewhere else. There are some that are quite tricky, but there's always some form of environmental clue. And I'm trying to build up over the early game, like almost tricking players into these spaces so that it builds up a sense of, I don't know, call it the player hunch. Like you have to sort of indirectly teach them how to engage with the level of secrets in your game so that if they see a collectible somewhere and can't figure out how to get there, they know the game's invisible language for what is suspicious to try and narrow down where they're looking. And that just, I guess, takes time to develop.
Yeah. No, as a player, I was really appreciative of that kind of outlook towards that section of the game. I mean, I'm not the best sometimes at figuring out what the game is asking of me, and there have been many instances where obviously I've had to look up a walkthrough or this, that, and the other. And obviously, I played Scrabdackle pre-release, so there was no guides or anything for me to look up. But I was challenged. But as you say, I wasn't stuck where I thought, I really don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. I really need to look something up. Never had that experience playing Scrabdackle. I feel like you've obviously succeeded where you on that front.
Thank you. There is a lot of playtesting that goes into that. I should also say I essentially work alone, but there is a very committed volunteer playtest group in the community that I think I could make the game without them, but it would be a lesser experience without them for sure. Like a really critical feedback to get early. Like this area felt like you moved through it too quick. This puzzle didn't make sense to me. Oh, there's a quiz later in the game that I rewrote I feel like a few days before launch because it's supposed to test you on things about the game and lore.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so hard that not a single playtester could get through it without brute forcing.
I bet you when you was writing it, you thought, "Oh, this is easy."
Yeah, because you're essentially the game master. You're sort of running this campaign, and it all feels so clear to you, but it's hard to put yourself in the player's position.
Yeah, I guess because like in some ways you're kind of living in this world all the time, aren't you? It's like the second world for you, and then that's great for the playtesters. And thank you to the playtesters for all their great work, because obviously, as you say, without their input, the game would have been a lot different.
There's lots of time to tune when you get feedback. And I guess as any developer needs to kind of build that skill of what feedback do you action and what feedback do you not.
Mm-hmm.
But without any feedback, like if you're not listening to people, you're not going to get anywhere. There's a thing happening right now among some of the community where there is, there's what we call a lore crumb, where there's a thing with a big implication about the world that is out there in the game that I thought would be really, not necessarily obvious, but I thought that the people who are really dialed into the minutia of the lore in the game would immediately clock this for what it is. And no one has, so I know that I need to tune it.
Mm.
But we're having a fun time with like me saying, yeah, there's a big lore crumb out there. No one's found it. Here's the rough area. I'm going to make it easier to find later, but for the time being, do you want to challenge yourself and see if you can get it without hints? Yeah. And I just don't know until the players take a look.
There's one character in Act 1 of Scrabdackle I kind of need to ask you about. And I don't know if you might guess who this might be.
Oh, a wide variety of characters are coming to mind. I'm ready.
Well, it's Batnik. Basically, I want to hear Batnik's backstory. How did he come to be? Because he's obviously, anyone listening who doesn't know this character, he crops up, but he's a really cool bat. He's got his sunglasses on and he's got some witty dialogue, and he keeps running away from you when you're trying to get this item that he's got, which obviously ends up in a boss fight. I don't know. There's something about Batnik that I really liked. His name kind of reminds me of some old school cartoon for some reason, and I'm just interested in his origins. All
right, yeah. So I guess this is a good example of the sort of design approach I have, which is it is pretty much the same as how I used to design for like D&D campaigns, where I will start with something really simple and I will start to flesh it out as it becomes relevant to, rather than sort of trying to pre-plan it all. And usually what I find makes the most sort of interesting outcome is when I complicate an idea. So the character of Batnik is, the origin is, well, I wanted you to fight a boss on a mountaintop. I thought that would be cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sort of works backwards from that, but it's more backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and kind of getting adjusted and tightened and narrowed as it goes. So I had this big, burly, like Jim Bro Eagle looking character, and I wanted a very like punchable face, I guess.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that satisfying of a design to draw. So I used to, before I was really working on the game, I would just sketch characters on the subway to work. And I was trying to draw something else that would feel sort of aerial related. And I tried out a bat and I slapped on some sunglasses, and it felt like a good look. But the character initially is, you don't start with a rich character. You start with a really simple thing, which is this sort of like, hey, wise guy kind of pushy, cocky character. And, the way to the boss fight needs more engagement with the character. Otherwise, it's sort of, a little bit less fulfilling if you don't really know why you're fighting or what you're fighting. So you need to engage with this character along the way. How do you end up chasing them? Well, I wanted to have kind of some smaller bat enemies. It's actually more interesting if I just make there be specifically 3, and they're like the pups of the character. So now they've become sort of this, like, indirectly, I didn't plan this out, but I've ended up with this sort of single parent character who both is and is not doing a good job at the same time. I guess it wouldn't be interesting to me if you fight this character who acts all tough, and then after the fight, they act all tough, unless you're exploring a really specific insecurity. But in this case, if, the pups fly away, this tough guy character can also be really sad about that, and also not really get up and do anything about it. And then you start to have like thematic connection to the rest of the game as you go do it, not because you're the only person who can, but because you're the only person who will. So it just grows over time, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to hear how he came to be, from that origin point to be in a thing. I just need a boss character so we can fight him at the top of a mountain to becoming a single dad, cool, lazy parent. And that journey is brilliant to hear that start to where he ends.
Yeah, there's a fun thing with the design. I really like this for lots of things, but it's especially fun with the video game because I think it's less common, is you take these characters that you're dealing with in, call it video game space, you're going through levels and challenges and things like that. And then if this character lives somewhere, like if this bat character lives on the mountain, well, where do they sleep? Like, what do they eat? And there's simple questions. It's not, turning the active world building on its head, but to answer them, you really have to engage with your own world. And it has to be like, it's almost impossible to answer those questions without developing your world, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you end up with like, well, what do these characters do when they're not flying around? They sit in a hammock. They eat marshmallows. They have a big wheat field that they use for tea, and there's a little teapot. They have a big, mostly clean but not completely clean couch and family art up on the wall.
I think that's one of the things I really liked about the bosses in Scrabdackle, is because they weren't there just to be a challenging thing in the game and then they're gone. They had an impact in the world. They didn't just disappear. They had some kind of backstory. Even like the Flamingo King, in the Ducklands, he didn't just blow up and never to be seen again.
Yeah.
There's a whole interconnectivity between them, and well, not in between each bosses, but between the bosses and the world, and like they've all got their own little backstory, and I really liked that about the game.
I almost feel sometimes when I think about it that like most bosses are characters. There are very few who aren't really actual characters in the game. And I often think of it as like, I really like the boss fights. They're very important to me. But I do think in a sense, I almost have to get the boss fight out of the way so that you can actually have their character quest. Where I rarely want to have this big character quest leads up to a big confrontation at the end of the area. I want to get to the point where you can just talk with this character, and usually you have to be post-conflict, or at least post-physical conflict, to sort of set the stage for doing that if someone doesn't want to talk with you or engage with you.
Have you heard of the game the Dark Queen of Morthome?
Yes, yeah.
Have you played it at all?
I have watched a playthrough on YouTube.
Oh, okay. So you got the general idea. I played that game a couple of months ago. It's really made me think differently about just bosses in general in games. Like I'm trying to fight these things, and I'm now in the back of my brain a little bit going, well, what's your backstory? What's life like for you? I still had those kind of thoughts playing Scrabdackle, but thankfully in some ways some of those questions were answered for me.
Yeah, I hope it's the type of thing where if even in like writing and stuff like that, I want to convey the critical information that's necessary for the player, but it always needs to be through the character's voice and come about in a way that feels natural to those characters. And that's also true with someone who acts as a boss at one point and maybe doesn't later or something like that.
One of the other things that really surprised me, I guess, when I went into Scrabdackle was the twin stick controls. I kind of wasn't expecting that, and I wondered how it would work within this kind of top-down adventure Metrovania game, but it worked really well. What was the thought process behind putting twin stick controls into the game?
I've always felt like it's a mouse and keyboard game, and developing gamepad controls was something that if I wasn't doing a commercial project, I probably just never would have done. The general sort of combat or navigation system is keep it very simple. You aim, you shoot, you do have to lead your shots a little bit, and you need to manage your own positioning to be out of the enemy's way. And that's largely all of it, to be honest.
Okay.
But with there are older Zelda games that are strong inspirations for me, but what I've often found is a modern game that talks about Zelda influences often will take almost the exact same format in terms of how you engage, where your sword slash is the same quarter circle that is a perfect 90-degree interval, and your options are sort of just as limited as if you were emulating an old Game Boy game. I like stuff like melee combat. I like that there's a sword spell in the game that you unlock, but at the end of the day, if I want you to be able to move and sort of click on things, whether you're studying it for with the scry spell for your notebook to write down a little journal entry, or you're shooting at something, if you're moving with one hand and attacking with the other, then that's always going to translate on a gamepad to moving with one stick and aiming with the other stick, I suppose.
Yeah, because I remember when I fired up the game for the first time, and it said about keyboard and mouse, and I was playing it on the Steam Deck, and I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be interesting. Thankfully, it just kind of reverted to a gamepad mechanics. Yeah, it all worked really well. I kind of want Nintendo to do the next Zelda game, top-down Zelda game, to have twin stick shooting in it and stuff. I think it'd be quite interesting.
If I had wanted to restrict things to purely orthogonal interactions, you can only shoot directly north, south, east, west, and so on, I could probably have avoided twin stick controls, but that would also be very limiting from a design perspective.
Yeah. No, it felt natural. I never felt taken out of the game because I was struggling with the controls at all. It was very smooth and natural for me.
Oh, I'm glad. I got Steam Deck working a day or two before the review keys went out.
Oh, really? Oh, I'm very appreciative then. Thank you. The other aspect of Scrabdackle is in its writing. I really, really enjoyed the writing in the game. The conversations between Blue, the wizard, the main protagonist, and the other characters of the game were fun to read. I can be one for skipping a lot of conversations in games. I kind of just want to get on with the game, and I feel like a lot of conversations in games are just there to be there. They're not overly necessary. But there was something about the writing in the game that just made me want to read them and just to stay to the end of the script. It was really enjoyable. When it came to the writing of the game, was it a really long process for you?
This is interesting because there's an early version of this where I had planned to have no writing at all in the game.
Oh.
Back in, I guess, mid 2020, before I was entirely sure that I would even release a public demo, I was still just making it as a hobby project for myself. I was trying to plan a game that required no dialogue, that would just have sort of environmental cues, or maybe the occasional directional glyphs in a speech bubble, perhaps, for someone to kind of tell you, enemy that way. But it wasn't a game, I never thought about a game that I was writing for, so to speak. And just on a whim, I ended up writing this conversation. I think the first one was between the snake vendor character, Hist, and Blue. You can find them really early in the game in just a small little cove. And I stuck it in the demo when I decided I would do one and put it out there. And it got really, really good feedback. People just enjoyed reading it. And I thought, oh, shoot, now the game's got to have writing in it. But I never planned to write a lot. Often I just I guess I write until it feels right, where I know the core things that need to get communicated, whether that's plot or where to go or other sort of critical information, hints, things like that. But usually what I'm trying to do is get myself into the proper character voice for whatever the main NPC is speaking. And I'll start out just writing like almost a test conversation that I know I'm going to probably scrap and throw away. And I almost just see what they end up talking about, or I'll know that there's a main thing that you need to ask about, and I'll give the player an option to ask about it halfway through the conversation. And then, I want to add something. Well, what if the player asks about this other thing that they've been looking into that has nothing to do with the critical thing that you're here for, but I think it'd be an interesting conversation. So I'll go write that branch too. And it starts to get into this sort of messy, like I had to build my own editor for managing the dialogue because it's very branchy and nonlinear, and things disconnect and reconnect depending on, are you rude to a character or not? It ended up being, I guess, a lot of work, but I don't usually think of the writing as hard as much as I just need to be in a good mindset where I can sit down and get myself into the character voice and do it. Mm-hmm. And I want to, I suppose not consciously, but unconsciously, I want to make sure that you're seeing a side of the player character as well, that they don't respond to everything the same way. They don't respond to everyone the same way. When they encounter a younger character, they're a little bit more bratty. If they encounter a character who's older, they might be more polite and sort of socially like, hello there, ma'am. Can I help you cross the street type of thing? Or shift depending on how they feel they're being spoken to. And there's a lot of stuff that ends up as subtext that's there to be seen if you're looking for it, or maybe just kind of quietly experienced. That's like the main character, Blue, has a lot of baggage with academia and feeling like they're not a good student in a society that is about being a good theoretical student and not really doing that much practical stuff. And it comes up in a lot of different ways between different characters. And it comes up with like, there might be a character being rude to Blue, but if they embody something that Blue thinks they are supposed to look up to, Blue will show them a lot of deference and patience anyways. Yeah, I guess I think about writing as a thing that needs to get done, but if I'm writing just so that the player gets critical information, I might as well just not write anything.
And with the writing, was it a conscious decision to like make sure that there were not too much text at any one time? Like, I can't really remember there being like a load of text at any one time with a lot of reading involving. They were all quite short, snappy pieces of writing. Was that a conscious thing for you as well to do that?
Yeah, I have a really hard time with games that I think don't respect my time, or I have the perception that it's not respecting my time. And I think very frequently about like, I need to earn the player caring about whatever I'm doing. So for the most part, that's usually like, if I have a conversation hook, if I think this is going to be an interesting conversation or lead to an interesting quest, then the start of the conversation also needs to be interesting. Because if it's not, I think players should just move on and miss the quest, because that's my bad. Part of that is over time trying to communicate to the player, like, I will not have long conversations very often. So I hope that I have bought some sort of benefit of the doubt for the rare times that there is a very long conversation. There's one at the essentially the very end of the game that's like the big lore conversation that can be almost 10 minutes if you're reading slowly. And I was nervous about it, and I wanted to have off ramps at one point, but I thought like, no, like the whole game has been building up to this thing. If the player has got here, I need to trust that by now they care, but I still need to write this conversation in an interesting way so that you're not just getting the critical lore information, you're also understanding how these characters are engaging with each other and think about each other, and watching that change kind of live in front of you, I guess.
That were you saying about respecting the player's time? Is that where this mechanic came where you can just leave a conversation, you could just walk away and while the NPCs talking and you could just go off and do whatever you wanted to do.
Yeah, essentially. And it's a really tough thing to commit to. Like, trying to apply this over a large game with a lot of scope, you can frequently see why people don't do this for many practical reasons. Because if you let people leave midway through a conversation and come back, and then the character starts re-saying information that you've heard before, that kind of takes you out of the world space a little bit. So often, most conversations with a major character, there's an intro conversation that is relatively linear that leads to what I think of as the main hub, a sort of a spot where if you've gotten here, you've gotten all the critical information, you've gotten any key items if they give you a key item, and everything from there is sort of optional. You can ask more about different topics, but you don't have to. And all of those branches will always come back around to the main hub. But usually for the intro conversation, there are like anywhere from 4 to like 18 points that if you leave and come back in between these 3 specific dialogue lines, the circumstances of what the character says as you leave and come back have to be slightly different based on that specific point in the intro conversation. And it's really hard to accommodate. Or if you have a character that needs to convey really critical, like, go here, do this. Well, what if someone moves on before you get there? How do you convey that? Can you secretly lock the player into a space without making them feel locked in or like their agency's being taken away? And if I need to do that, how quickly can I ensure that their agency's returned to them?
It was a really interesting mechanic of the game. Like, I didn't do it often obviously, because I said I was enjoying the conversations anyways, but I did try it a few times just to see what it was like and how well it worked. And it worked really well. I was just really impressed with the work that you had put into this particular section of the game to make it work and be so smooth as it is.
Oh, thank you. One of the other aspects of it is because I don't take away player control during the conversation, it also means that I can't overlap the controls for dialogue with the controls for gameplay. And that on a gamepad was really challenging because there's only so many buttons, and at all times you need access to the buttons for dialogue and the buttons for shooting and moving and aiming and opening different menus. I have to support 2 almost conflicting contexts at once. And there were some points where I thought I might have to really cut down on the agency of players to be able to support gamepads at all. But I got there in the end, I guess.
We've hinted at this throughout our conversation about this being Act 1 of Scrabdackle and it being an episodic release. Tell us a little bit about that decision, Jake. Like, it seems to be becoming more and more popular within video games of releasing them in episode. The recent release of Dispatch, I know it's a completely different kind of game, but it was released in episodes and a lot of people really, really dug it. Was this your thought of Scrabdackle, putting it in episodes?
The initial thought was more about the gameplay structure, where I had been planning to release the final game, all 3 acts at once, and it would still just carry the act structure within it. And I liked the idea of, like, you have this sense of nonlinearity. You can go most places that you want. There's several regions early in the game that are what I consider exploration regions. So you can kind of just wander through them at your leisure. And then connected to those are what I think of as dungeon regions, where they're much more linear, puzzle-oriented, sort of, there's a core storyline that you're progressing as you go through it. And I liked the idea of there sort of being a bottleneck point to make sure that you have done enough content before you move on to the next big set, but not being specific about what content you've done. So the main, I guess, MacGuffin that you're picking up throughout the game are these purple glowing octahedrons that are some kind of magical thing. For our purposes, it doesn't really matter. It's just an important magic thing. And there's an area at the very end of the first act that has these gates that open if you have enough. And I've got this sort of document that I use to work out how much content based on how many available octahedrons are out there the player needs to have dealt with before they can progress on to the next act. And I'll be using essentially the same mechanic for progression to the third act. So you again, sort of going into the second act, will have the world open up for you again and new areas to explore. And the same sort of approach of you don't need to engage with any specific content or almost any specific content, but you do need to engage with enough of it. So it's still self-led, it's still open-ended, but I can say, like, you know, if you get most of these gems from defeating bosses, I know that you've defeated at least, you know, all but one of the main bosses. But I don't know necessarily which main boss the player would have skipped if they've skipped them or if they're coming back later. And something about that, I guess, was just always appealing to me. It used to be more open-ended. It used to be like in the actual release of the game, it's really important to sort of pick up at least one of 3 spells that are out in the world to be able to access the Wizard Academy as your sort of final area of the act. But even that was a change midway through development. There was, in the original plan, which would have been a bad idea, I'm glad I changed it, but in the original plan, even the Wizard Academy would have been optional and you could have never gone back there if you didn't want to. It's a little too open-ended.
What's the times between each act is your plan at the moment?
It's a little bit tricky. I was partway through the development of Act 2 before I needed to pause. And at this point, like, all of the systems for the game are done, all of the architecture, everything like that. My art and animation pipelines are really, I guess, well laid out. And quite a lot of music for the full game is actually written. I think I'm at about 85-90% of the music for the full game being done. But every time I try and estimate this, I always end up undershooting it. Part of my process, not necessarily intentionally, I struggle to not be a perfectionist. If I think something needs more time, it's really hard to not just spend more time on it. Or if I get feedback from playtesters and I think, yeah, you know, that's really valid feedback, I should really address that. And addressing that takes a week, then I'll be doing an extra week. So I've loosely been saying probably about a year in between acts to cover like quite a large amount of content, even though it's all planned out. But it's possible it'll be, you know, a year and change in between.
I mean, there's so many games that come out now that the wait doesn't feel as long, does it?
Well, there are games out there that's like, you know, Deltarune and stuff like that.
Sure, yeah.
The structure of Deltarune isn't something I was personally looking at or trying to model, but it is really exciting, I think, that if they do occasional chapter releases and those chapters are a big deal and sort of a whole contained thing on their own, that it's a really exciting moment for the community and player base to go through, gain new information, experience some things, sort of go hunting for extra side secrets together, and having this shared experience of like speculating and showing excitement and wondering what's going to be coming up. And that's not specifically influencing my decision to have 3 acts in the game, but it is influencing my decision to release as 3 acts, which is partly for me. I can't work on stuff that I don't share with people for that long if I'm just working on my own. But I know that each act sets up something, lets you explore it, and then kind of ends with a new narrative plateau and understanding of the world and the situations that's going on. So it leaves you at what I hope is an interesting point to wonder and speculate from. And then the second act release will be a similar thing, where by the end of it, you will be at sort of a new plateau of understanding of what's going on in the world and who's making what moves and things like that.
You know, even Act 1 on its own is over 10 hours of playtime. That's quite a chunk. It's quite a chunk of a game. You know, and I think I read that the all 3 acts together would be like 40 hours. Is that about right?
Probably more. On the standard difficulty, there is variation depending on what difficulty people are playing, because the amount of time that you spend on a boss is highly variable. But for most people on the default difficulty, finishing the game, all main content is around 15 hours, and it can be up to 3 more if you are sort of going for every collectible, every secret, etc. And that's roughly the same scope for the rest of the game, maybe with a little more meat on the finale. So I've bitten off quite a lot, and I will be chewing for a long time.
Sure. But that I think that's what I was trying to say is that, yeah, again, I feel like you're respecting our time because in some instances, I've played a big game, or a big game has put me off playing it in general. Like it's a 50, 60-hour game. I probably won't play that. Or, when I've attempted to play some bigger games, I've kind of started to feel fatigue by the end, and kind of just wanting it to be over because I've kind of had enough, felt like it stretched too long because I've been playing it for so long. So I feel like this kind of this structure that you've put in place for Scrabdackle is really refreshing for me and hopefully for a lot of other people, where we can get a chunk of the game and feel fulfilled, and then we can walk away and just have a break, knowing that we can come back in a year or so time and have another new experience within Scrabdackle. I think that's quite a clever way of going about it, actually.
I appreciate that you think it's clever. It's really been a challenge. The hardest thing to communicate with the game is that an act is sort of a complete and whole thing, and that it's an episode that not only can be digested on its own, but actually I think is a better experience if you do and you walk away for a bit and then come back. Because to a lot of people, it's not the most familiar structure, and it can just come across as, all right, so your game's not done. I'll come back when it's done. But if I was a sane person, this would be, maybe 3 separate games or something like that. Mm-hmm. The problem is there's a lot of Metroidvania, like open interconnected world roots at the heart of the game. So the second act doesn't just expand in one direction. I can't just take your save and put you in a new section of Scrabdackle. You still have access to the same world from Act 1, and the areas that you unlock to explore are not all at the same edge of the Act 1 territory, but sort of scattered around the edge of the Act 1 territory, and then ditto again for Act 3. And sometimes things that you pick up in later acts will recontextualize earlier parts of the game. So I really can't separate it in a sense.
Yeah, my mind's just blown from that sentence that you just said. Like, must be a massive challenge for you, because like you saying that to me, and like my brain can't comprehend all those different structures that you've got to think about for these different acts and how the players play it and everything. Yeah, it must be complete.
It's problematically ambitious, is how I might describe it.
Yeah, definitely.
So I can give you sort of an interesting case for this. So at the start of Act 1, you're gated in this tutorial area essentially until you find your wand, and then you understand that you can break the stuff that's keeping you in the tutorial and go where you like. And Acts 2 and 3 will have a similar structure with, you're in a relatively small tutorial area, and then you get some kind of new item, ability, or spell or whatever that kind of unlocks the rest of the act for you. And at the start of the second act, you get a spell that lets you jump. And that's the thing that unlocks kind of progressing through the world. But now that recontextualizes the entire first act as, okay, well, this hill that's got a sticker on one side, and you need to circle the whole hill to try and find where the ramp is. Mm-hmm. You could also just come back later and just jump right up to the sticker just like that. And there's this real risk of things you get later on making earlier challenges and puzzles essentially redundant. And that's a very hard thing to approach. I really just need to trust the player that they'll still have a good time, and that they can come back on a second playthrough, do something different in a different order, and end up engaging with the puzzle. And trust myself that there's still enough worthwhile in the game to allow this possibility and not feel like, oh, this content I made was a waste of time because you can bypass it. And I think that's the thing that really makes the player's experience feel the most like theirs rather than what they're being led through, is the possibility to do things quote unquote out of order or in your own order, or walk away or not.
I'm kind of sitting here, and all I can imagine now obviously is you kind of like standing in front of a big notice board, like a policeman, and like you've got all these different strings going to all these different sections, to make sure that it all connect.
Yeah, I've got some wild flowchart documents actually.
I bet. But I've got faith in you, Jake. Yeah, I know you can nail it. I'm sure you'll smash it.
Oh, thank you.
a couple more questions, and the first is: did you have? Look, we've talked a lot about the development of Act One, but was there any specific sections of the development that was really challenging for you?
I guess I'll say the biggest hurdle for me has been optimization of the code and making it work for different devices, configurations, processors, things like that. I think I have a solid programming foundation from a logical thinking perspective, but my experience is really limited. And I think it really shows, unfortunately, in the game that I learned to code while I was making it because there were things I just didn't think to consider until it was sort of baked into the game. So there's a lot of architecture that, relies on your CPU really heavily and not really on your GPU at all because I didn't really know what a shader was. So I would approach a challenge in a way that I think most game developers would say, oh, this is a shader problem, solve it with a shader. And I just didn't either know how to or think to. And I would solve it in this roundabout way that had the same effect, but relies more on your CPU processor. So for some people, the game runs great. And for some people, the game runs kind of rough because they can't, their computer needs more of thing A and less of thing B, and I'm only asking for usage of thing A or so on. Getting the game to load quickly and perform well when I'm essentially modeling a 3D environment using 2D objects, which is also not recommended. There's been a lot of difficulty trying to make sure it just works for everybody, which it can be rough for some people right now.
It's a challenge, isn't it, for any developer, especially like PC. There's so many different configurations out there that it just must be like a needle in a haystack.
Yeah. Well, there are things I can think of now that I have more experience. Like the character code that manages objects in the world, NPCs, enemies, the main player, has a lot of things that now I could reapproach and know how to do it in a more performant way and more memory efficient way. But for me to change it now would almost certainly break most of the game, and I would have to go and fix all the issues that come about from these things being changed because they are assumptions being made by later code. Mm. So you're really locked into a position where if you want to improve something that is foundational, it's a huge amount of time and work and being prepared to sort of rebug test everything. It makes it unfortunately a little bit challenging.
Yeah, it sounds a bit of a nightmare too.
There have been nightmare moments, yeah.
I'm sure, yeah.
If you are someone who looks into games that are sort of similar in terms of presentation from the certain top-down perspective to this, you will notice two things usually, or one of two things. And one is often that they don't have height levels, so you don't walk on top of different parts of the map. You're sort of always just on the floor or in the air, and the floor is always the same height. Or you will notice behind the scenes that they are actually running a 3D engine and just using billboard sprites to present it as 2D. And the reason people do that is because it's so much smarter. It's such a better way to do it. But I didn't know how to work in 3D. So I worked in 2D and I hammered things together, and I ran into all the problems that made people like from proper game development teams go, okay, we can't do it this way. And I just kept pushing until I got it kind of working. But it's not a path, I recommend, technically speaking. There are some situations where if it was possible to go back and start over, that would probably be the best path forward from a technical perspective. But a lot of things are complicated by the fact that it's basically just me. I don't have a team. And if I don't do it, no one's going to do it. So if I go back and work on something foundational that's going to improve, the technical aspect, that also means all of that time I'm doing comes away from time for the art or the writing or coding and enemy design or something like that. So there are limitations, or I might not be using the term right. I think it's a zero-sum kind of thing where the time always has to come from somewhere. So it's always choosing one priority means deprioritizing something else.
Jake, what's next? What's next for Scrabdackle? I know Act 2 is coming, but is there console ports in the works?
Right now, I think it actually leads in from the previous question really well, because right now I'm trying to manage my own time and my own ability to make the game by currently exclusively making it for PC and in English. The publisher, we've had conversations. Of course, they're interested in console ports, but if I was to start approaching that now with so much game left to build, what I would almost certainly end up doing is, even for just one port, then I'm managing two separate builds of the game with two different needs. Mm-hmm. And I want to wait until the game is essentially done to look at that kind of thing, to avoid kind of doubling my workload. Similar for things like localization. So also, just to not mentally overwhelm myself, I'm keeping the goal on finish the game. And after that, things about sharing the game with a wider audience can come into view a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for my final question, Jake, if you could describe Scrabdackle in one word, what word would that be?
Curious.
How did you land on that one?
Well, the other thing coming to mind is rewarding as the intention of what I hope the experience is. But it is an odd little game. It's doing its own kind of approach to a fantasy setting. It wants you to engage with it as it is, not as other similar things are. And it is always rewarding you for being curious, for wondering, for thinking about something more. I think I want it to be a game where the more that you put in, the more you get out. I think the nature of wanting you to enjoy exploring and wondering what's ahead and what you might be able to do or ask someone about comes from a sense of curiosity that I think is in most people. And I really want to foster and make it feel like a game where that is rewarded.
I had a blast talking with Jake about Scrabdackle. He's such an easy and open person to talk to, and the stories he had on the game's development were truly fascinating. If you'd like to keep up to date with Jake, you can find him on BlueSky or in his Discord. I'll make sure to add links to those in the show description, and I'll also add the link to the game's Steam page too. Before I leave you, I would just like to remind you all that we have a Discord server where you can chat to the So Many Games crew and other like-minded people on video games, life and our work. We'd love for you to be a part of our community, so do come and say hello and let us know what you've been playing. Don't forget to check out somanygames.co.uk for all our latest reviews, articles and interviews. Links to the Discord, website and our Patreon will all be in the show description. Thank you for listening, and until next time, my name has been Jason. Please take care out there and happy gaming.
Do you find yourself playing older games and wishing that there were new discussions about those games? Enter Tales from the Backlog. Hi, I'm Dave Jackson, and on each episode, I'm joined by a guest to break down those games that may be stuck in your ever-expanding backlog. Each episode looks at one game in depth, focusing on mechanics, story, music, and other aspects with no spoilers until a clearly marked spoiler wall in the middle. If you've played the game, go ahead and climb that spoiler wall and enjoy in-depth story discussions, and if not, jump out when we warn you and maybe go play that game for yourself. We have over 100 episodes in the feed, everything from Disco Elysium to Tunic to discussion episodes about how to get into horror games, and if games actually need to be fun, or if they have more to offer. I guarantee that there's something in there for everybody. Once again, that's Tales from the Backlog, available wherever your podcasts are found.